You going?
Yep. Welcome, viewers. Welcome back for another week of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. Hope you had a good Monday and didn't end up with a case of the Mondays. This week we are following on from Harry, and if you remember last week, he had his very first defense against the dark arts class, or as Professor Quirrell calls it, battle magic. And anyway, so without further ado, let's get cracking on chapter 16, Locating the Hypothesis. Thursday. If you wanted to be specific, 7:24 a.m. on Thursday morning. Harry was sitting in his bed, a textbook lying limp in his motionless hands. Harry had just had an idea for a truly brilliant experimental test. It would mean waiting an extra hour for breakfast, but that's why he had cereal bars. No, this idea absolutely, positively had to be tested right away, immediately, now. Harry set the textbook aside, leapt out of bed, raced around his bed, yanked out the cabin level of his trunk, ran down the stairs, and started moving boxes of books around. He really needed to unpack and get bookcases at some point, but he was in the middle of his textbook reading contest with Hermione and falling behind, so he hadn't had time. Harry found the book he wanted and raced upstairs. The other boys were getting ready to go down to breakfast in the Great Hall and start the day. "Excuse me, can you do something for me?" said Harry. He was flipping through the book's index as he spoke, found the page with the first 10,000 primes, flipped to that page, and thrust the book at Anthony Goldstein. "Pick 2 3-digit numbers from the list. Don't tell me what they are. Just multiply them together and tell me the product. Oh, and can you do the calculation twice to double check? Please make really sure you've got the right answer. I'm not sure what's going to happen to me or the universe if you make a multiplication error." It said a lot about life in that dorm had been. It said a lot about what life in that dorm had been like over the past few days that Anthony didn't even bother saying anything like, "Why'd you suddenly flip out?" or "That seems really weird. What are your reasons for asking?" or "What do you mean you're not sure what's going to happen to the universe?" Anthony wordlessly accepted the book and took out a parchment and quill. Harry spun around and shut his eyes, making sure not to see anything, dancing back and forth, bouncing up and down with impatience. He got a pad and paper and a mechanical pencil and got ready to write. "Okay," Anthony said, 181,429. Harry wrote down 181,429. He repeated what he'd just written down, and Anthony confirmed it. Then Harry raced back down into the cabin level of his trunk, glanced at his watch. The watch said 4:28, which meant 7:28, and then shut his eyes. Around 30 seconds later, Harry heard the sound of steps, followed by the sound of the cabin level of his trunk sliding shut. Harry wasn't worried about suffocating. An automatic air freshening charm was part of what you got if you were willing to buy a really good truck. Wasn't magic wonderful? He didn't have to worry about electricity bills. And when Harry opened his eyes, he saw just what he'd been hoping to see, a folded piece of paper left on the floor, the gift of his future self. "Call that piece of paper paper 2. Harry tore a piece of paper off his pad. "Call that paper." It was, of course, the same piece of paper. You could even see, if you looked closely, that the ragged edges matched. Harry viewed in his mind the algorithm that he would follow. If Harry opened up paper 2 and it was blank, then he would write 100 times 100 down on paper 1, fold it up, study for an hour, go back in time, drop off paper 1, which would thereby become paper 2, and head up on out of the cabin level to join his dorm mates for breakfast. If Harry opened paper number 2 and it had 2 numbers written on it, Harry would multiply those numbers together. If the product equaled 181,429, Harry would write down those 2 numbers on paper 1 and send paper 1 back in time. Otherwise, Harry would add 2 to the number on the right and write down the new pair of numbers on paper 1. Unless that made the number on the right greater than 997, in which case Harry would add 2 to the number on the left and write down 101 on the right. And if Harry said 997 times 997, and if paper 2 said 997 times 997, Harry would leave paper 1 blank, which meant that the only possible stable time loop was the one in which paper 2 contained the 2 prime factors of 181,429. If this worked, Harry could use it to recover any sort of answer that was easy to check but hard to find. He wouldn't have just shown that P equals NP once you had a time turner. This trick was more general than that. Harry could use it to find the combinations of combination locks or passwords of every sort. Maybe even find the entrance to Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets, if Harry could figure out some systematic way of describing all the locations in Hogwarts. It would be an awesome cheat, even by Harry's standards of cheating. Harry took paper 2 in his trembling hand and unfolded it. Paper 2 said in slightly shaky handwriting, "Don't mess with time." Harry wrote down "Don't mess with time" on paper 1 in slightly shaky handwriting, folded it neatly, and resolved not to do any more truly brilliant experiments on time until he was at least 15 years old. To the best of Harry's knowledge, that had been the scariest experimental result in the entire history of science. It had been somewhat difficult for Harry to focus on reading his textbook for the next hour. That was how Harry's Thursday started. Thursday, if you wanted to be specific, 32 p.m. on Thursday afternoon. Harry and all the other boys in the first year were outside on a grassy field with Madame Hooch, standing next to the Hogwarts supply of broomsticks. The girls were learning to fly separately. Apparently, for some reason, girls didn't want to learn how to fly on broomsticks in the presence of boys. Harry had been a little wobbly all day long. He just couldn't seem to stop wondering how that particular stable time loop had been selected out of what was, in retrospect, a rather large space of possibilities. Also, seriously, broomsticks? He was going to fly on basically a line segment. Wasn't that pretty much the single most unstable shape you could possibly find, short of attempting to hold onto a point marble? Who selected that design for a flying device out of all possibilities? Harry had been hoping that it was just a figure of speech, but no, they were standing in front of what looked for all the world like ordinary wooden kitchen broomsticks. Had someone just gotten stuck on the idea of broomsticks and failed to consider anything else? It had to be. There was no way that the optimal design for cleaning kitchens and flying would happen to coincide if you worked them out from scratch. It was a clear day with a bright blue sky and a brilliant sun that was just begging to get in your eyes and make it impossible to see if you were trying to fly around in the sky. The ground was nice and dry, smelling positively baked, and somehow felt very, very hard under Harry's shoes. Harry kept reminding himself that the lowest common denominator of 11-year-olds was expected to learn this, and it couldn't be that hard. "Stick out your right hand over the broom, or left hand if you're left-handed," called Madame Hooch, "and say up." "Up," everyone shouted. The broomstick leapt eagerly into Harry's hand, which put him at the head of the class for once. Apparently saying "up" was a lot more difficult than it looked, and most of the broomsticks were rolling around on the ground or trying to inch away from their would-be riders. Of course, Harry would have bet money that Hermione had done at least as well when it came her own turn to try earlier in the day. There couldn't possibly be anything he could master on the first try which would baffle Hermione. And if there was, and it turned out to be broomstick riding instead of anything intellectual, Harry would just die. It took a while for everyone to get a broomstick in front of them. Madame Hooch showed them how to mount and then walked around the field, correcting grips and stances. Apparently, even among the few children who'd been allowed to fly at home, they hadn't been taught to do it correctly. Madam Hooch surveyed the field of boys and nodded. "Now, when I blow my whistle, you kick off from the ground, hard." Harry swallowed hard, trying to quell the queasy feeling in his stomach. "Keep your broom steady, rise a few feet, and then come straight back down by leaning forward slightly. On my whistle, 3, 2... One of the brooms shot skyward, accompanied by a young boy's screams of horror, not delight. The boy was spinning at an awful rate as he descended. They only got a glimpse of his white face. As though in slow motion, Harry was leaping back off his broomstick and scrabbling for his wand, though he didn't really know what he planned to do with it. He had exactly 2 sessions of charms, and the last one had been the hover charm, but Harry had only been able to cast the spell successfully 1 time out of 3, and he certainly couldn't levitate whole people. "If there is any hidden power in me, let it reveal itself now." "Come back, boy!" shouted Madam Hooch, which had been the most unhelpful instruction imaginable for dealing with an out-of-control broomstick. From a flying instructor and a fully automatic section of Harry's brain added Madam Hooch to its tally of fools. And the boy was thrown off the broomstick. He seemed to move very slowly through the air at first. "Wingardium Leviosa!" screamed Harry. The spell failed, and he could feel it fail. There was a thud and a distant cracking sound, and the boy lay face down on the grass in a heap. Harry sheathed his wand and raced forward full speed. He arrived at the boy's side at the same time as Madam Hooch, and Harry reached into his pouch and tried to recall, oh God, what was the name? Never mind. He'd just tried Healer's Pack, and it popped up into his hand, and "Broken wrist," Madam Hooch said. "Calm down, boy. He just has a broken wrist." There was a sort of mental lurch as Harry's mind snapped out of panic mode. The emergency healing pack plus lay open in front of him, and there was a syringe of liquid fire in Harry's hand, which would have kept the boy's brain oxygenated if he'd managed to snap his neck. "Ah," Harry said in a rather wavering sort of voice. His heart was pounding so loudly that he almost couldn't hear himself panting for breath. "Broken bone, right, setting string?" "That's for emergencies only," snapped Madam Hooch. "Put it away. He's fine." She leaned over the boy, offering a hand. "Come on, boy. It's all right. Up you get." "You're not seriously going to make him ride the broomstick again?" Harry said in horror. Madam Hooch sent Harry a glare. "Of course not." She pulled the boy to his feet using his good arm. Harry saw with shock that it was Neville Longbottom again. What was with him? And she turned to all the watching children. "None of you is to move while I take this boy to the hospital wing. You leave those brooms where they are, or you will be out of Hogwarts before you can say Quidditch. Come on, dear." And Madam Hooch walked off with Neville, who was clutching his wrist and trying to control his sniffles. When they were out of earshot, one of the Slytherins started giggling. Set off the others. Harry turned and looked at them. It seemed like a good time to memorize some faces, and Harry saw that Draco was strolling towards him, accompanied by Mr. Crabbe and Mr. Goyle. Mr. Crabbe wasn't smiling. Mr. Goyle decidedly was. Draco himself was wearing a very controlled face that twitched occasionally, from which Harry inferred that Draco thought it was hilarious, but saw no political advantage to be gained by laughing about it now instead of in the Slytherin dungeons afterwards. "Well, Potter," Draco said in a low voice that didn't carry, still with that very controlled face that was twitching occasionally. "Just wanted to say, when you take advantage of emergencies to demonstrate leadership, you want to look like you're in total control of the situation, rather than, say, going into complete panic." Mr. Goyle giggled, and Draco shot him a quelling look. "But you probably scored a few points anyway. You need any help steering that healer's kit?" Harry turned to look at the healing pack, which got his own face turned away from Draco. "I think I'm fine," Harry said. He put the syringe back in its place, redid the latches, and stood up. Ernie Macmillan arrived just as Harry was feeding the pack into his moleskin pouch. "Thank you, Harry Potter, on behalf of Hufflepuff," Ernie Macmillan said formally. "It was a good try and a good thought." "Good thought indeed," drawled Draco. "Why didn't anyone in Hufflepuff have their wands out? Maybe if you'd all helped instead of just Potter, you could have caught him. I thought Hufflepuffs were supposed to stick together." Ernie looked like he was torn between getting angry and wanting to die of shame. "We didn't think of it in time." "Ah," said Draco. "Didn't think of it. Guess that's why it's better to have one Ravenclaw as a friend than all of Hufflepuff." "Oh, hell. How is Harry supposed to juggle this one?" "You're not helping," Harry said in a mild tone, hoping Draco would interpret that as, "You're interfering with my plans. Please shut up." "Hey, what's this?" said Mr. Goyle. He stooped to the grass and picked up something around the size of a large marble, a glass ball that seemed to be filled with a swirling white mist. Ernie blinked. "Neville's Rembrole." "What's a Rembrole?" asked Harry. "It turns red if you've forgotten something," Ernie said. "It doesn't tell you what you forgot, though. Give it here, please. I'll hand it back to Neville later." Ernie held out his hand. A sudden grin flashed across Mr. Goyle's face. He spun around and raced away. Ernie stood still for a moment in surprise and then shouted, "Hey!" and ran after Mr. Goyle. And Mr. Goyle grabbed a broomstick, hopped on with one smooth motion and took to the air. Harry's jaw dropped. Hadn't Mayor Hooch said that would get him expelled? "That idiot!" Draco hissed. He opened his mouth to shout. "Hey!" shouted Ernie. "That's Neville's! Give it back!" The Slytherin started cheering and hooting. Draco's mouth snapped shut. Harry caught the sudden look of indecision on his face. "Draco," Harry said in a low tone, "if you don't order that idiot back to the ground, the teacher's going to get back and—" "Come and get it, Hufflepuffle!" shouted Mr. Goyle, and a great cheer went up from the Slytherins. "I can't," whispered Draco. "Everyone in Slytherin will think I'm weak." "And if Mr. Goyle gets expelled," hissed Harry, "your father's going to think you're a moron." Draco's face twisted in agony. At that moment, "Hey, Slither Slime!" shouted Ernie. "Didn't anyone tell you that Hufflepuffs stick together? Wands out, Hufflepuff!" And there was suddenly a whole lot of wands pointed in Mr. Goyle's direction. 3 seconds later, "Wands out, Slytherin!" And around 5 different Slytherins said around 5 different Slytherins. And there were a whole lot of wands pointed in Hufflepuff's direction. 2 seconds later, "Wands out, Gryffindor!" "Do something, Potter," whispered Draco. "I can't be the one to stop this. It has to be you. I'll do you a favour. Just think of something. You aren't supposed to be brilliant." In around 5.5 seconds, Harry realised someone was going to cast the Sumerian Simple Strike Hex. By the time it was over and the teachers were done expelling people, the only boys left in his year would be Ravenclaws. "Wands out, Ravenclaw!" shouted Michael Corner, who was apparently feeling left out of the disaster. "Gregory Goyle!" screamed Harry. "I challenge you to a contest for the possession of Neville's Rembrole." There was a sudden pause. "Oh, really?" said Draco in the loudest drawl Harry had ever heard. "That sounds interesting. What sort of a contest, Potter?" Contest had been as far as Harry's inspiration had gotten. What sort of contest? He couldn't say chess because Draco wouldn't be able to accept without it looking strange. He couldn't say arm wrestling because Mr. Goyle would crush him. "How about this?" Harry said loudly. Gregory Goyle and I stand apart from each other, and no one else is allowed to come near either of us. We don't use our wands, and neither does anyone else. I don't move from where I'm standing, and neither does he. If I can get my hands on Neville's Rembrall, then Gregory Goyle relinquishes all claim to that Rembrall he's holding and gives it to me. There was another pause as people's looks of relief transmuted to confusion. Ha, Potter, said Draco loudly. I'd like to see you do that. Mr. Goyle accepts. It's on, said Harry. Potter, what? whispered Draco, which he somehow did without moving his lips. Harry didn't know how to answer without moving his. People were putting their wands away, and Mr. Goyle swooped gracefully to the ground, looking rather confused. Some Hufflepuffs started over towards Mr. Goyle, but Harry shot them a desperately pleading look, and they backed off. Harry walked towards Mr. Goyle and stopped where he was, a few paces away, far enough apart that they couldn't reach each other. Slowly, deliberately, Harry sheathed his wand. Everyone else backed away. Harry swallowed. He knew in broad outline what he wanted to do, but it had to be done in such a way that no one understood what he'd done. All right, Harry said loudly. And now? He took a deep breath, raised one hand, fingers ready to snap. There were gasps from anyone who'd heard about the pies, which was practically everyone. I call upon the insanity of Hogwarts. Happy, happy, boom, boom, swamp, swamp, swamp. And Harry snapped his fingers. A lot of people flinched, and nothing happened. Harry let the silence stretch on for a while, developing until, someone said, Is that it? Harry looked at the boy who'd spoken. Look in front of you. You see that patch of ground that looks barren without any grass on it? Yeah, said the boy, a Gryffindor, digging something. Dig it up. Now Harry was getting a lot of strange looks. Why? Said Dean something. Just do it, said Terry Boot in a weary voice. No point asking why. Trust me on this one. Dean something knelt down and began to scoop away dirt. After a minute or so, Dean stood up again. There's nothing there, said Dean. Dean said. Huh? Harry had been planning to go back in time and bury a treasure map that would lead to another treasure map that would lead to Neville's Rembrall, which he would put there after getting it back from Mr. Goyle. Then Harry realised there was a much simpler way which didn't threaten the secret of time turners quite as much. Thanks, Dean, Harry said loudly. Ernie, would you look around on the ground where Neville fell and see if you can find Neville's Rembrall? People looked even more confused. Just do it, said Terry Boot. He'll keep trying until something works, and the scary thing is that... Merlin, gasped Ernie. He was holding up Neville's Rembrall. It's here, right where he fell. What? Cried Mr. Goyle. He was looking down and saw that he was still holding Neville's Rembrall. There was a rather long pause. Said Dean something. That's not possible, is it? It's a plot hole, Harry said. I made myself weird enough to distract the universe for a moment, and it forgot that Mr. Goyle had already picked up the Rembrall. No, wait, I mean, that's totally not possible. Excuse me, are we all standing around here waiting to go flying on broomsticks? Yes, we are, so shut up. Anyway, once I got my hands on Neville's Rembrall, the contest is over, and Gregory Goyle has to relinquish all claim to the Rembrall he's holding and give it to me. Those were the terms, remember? Harry stretched out a hand and beckoned Ernie. Just run over here, since no one's supposed to get close to me. Okay? Hold on, shouted a Slytherin, blazed Zabini. Harry wasn't likely to forget that name. How did he know that's Neville's Rembrall? You could have just dropped another Rembrall there. The Slytherin's strong with this one, Harry said, smiling. But you have my word that the one Ernie's holding is Neville's. No comment about the one Gregory Goyle's holding. Zabini spun to Draco. Malfoy! You're not just going to let him get away with that. Shut up, you, rumbled Mr. Crabbe, standing behind Draco. Mr. Malfoy doesn't need you to tell him what to do. Good Nick. My bet was with Draco of the noble and most ancient house of Malfoy, Harry said. Not with you, Zabini. I have done what Mr. Malfoy said he'd like to see me do. As for the judgment of the bet, I leave that up to Mr. Malfoy. Harry inclined his head towards Draco and raised his eyebrows slightly. That ought to allow Draco to save enough face. There was a pause. You promise that's actually Neville's Rembrel? Draco said. Yes, Harry said. That's the one that'll go back to Neville, and it was his originally. And the one Gregory Goyle's holding goes to me. Draco nodded, looking decisive. I won't question the word of the noble house of Potter, then, no matter how strange that all was. And the noble and most ancient house of Malfoy keeps its word as well. Mr. Goyle, give that to Mr. Potter. Hey, Zabini said. He hasn't won yet. He hasn't got his hands on. Catch, Harry, said Ernie, and he tossed the Rembrel. Harry easily snapped the Rembrel out of the air. He'd always had good reflexes that way. There, Harry said. I win. Harry trailed off. All conversation stopped. The Rembrel was glowing bright red in his hand, blazing like a miniature sun that cast shadows on the ground in broad daylight. Thursday. If you want to be specific, 5:09 p.m. on Thursday afternoon in Professor McGonagall's office after flying classes, with an extra hour for Harry slipped in between. Professor McGonagall sitting on her stool, Harry in the hot seat in front of her desk. Professor, Harry said tightly, Slytherin were pointing their wands at Hufflepuff, Gryffindor were pointing their wands at Slytherin, some idiot called wands out in Ravenclaw, and I had maybe 5 seconds to keep the whole thing from blowing sky high. It was all I could think of. Professor McGonagall's face was pinched and angry. You are not to use the time turner in that fashion, Mr. Potter. Is the concept of secrecy not something you do not understand? Then I don't know how I did it. They don't know how I did it. They just think I do really weird things by snapping my fingers. I've done other weird stuff that can't be done with time turners even. And I'll do more stuff like that. And this case won't even stand out. I had to do it, Professor. You did not have to do it, snapped Professor McGonagall. All you needed to do was get this anonymous Slytherin back on the ground and the wands put away. You could have challenged him to a game of exploding snap, but no, you had to use the time turner in a flagrant and unnecessary manner. It was all I could think of. I don't even know what exploding snap is. They wouldn't have accepted a game of chess, and if I picked arm wrestling, I would have lost. Then you should have picked arm wrestling. Harry blinked. Then I'd have lost. Harry stopped. Professor McGonagall was looking very angry. I'm sorry, Professor McGonagall, Harry said in a small voice. I honestly didn't think of that, and you're right. I should have. It would have been brilliant if I had, but I just didn't think of it of that at all. Harry's voice trailed off. It was suddenly apparent to him that he'd had a lot of other options. He could have asked Draco to suggest something. He could have asked the crowd. His use of the time turner had been flagrant and unnecessary. There had been a giant space of possibilities. Why had he picked that one? Because he'd seen a way to win. Win possession of an unimportant trinket that the teachers would have taken back from Mr. Goyle anyway. Intent to win. That's what had gotten him. I'm sorry, Harry said, for my pride and my stupidity. Professor McGonagall wiped her hand across her forehead. Some of her anger seemed to dissipate, but her voice still came out hard. One more display like that, Mr. Potter, and you'll be returning that time turner. Do I make myself very clear? Yes, Harry said. I understand, and I'm sorry. Then, Mr. Potter, you will be allowed to retain the time turner for now, and considering the size of the debacle you did, in fact, avert, I will not deduct any house points from Ravenclaw. Plus, you couldn't explain why you deducted the house points, but Harry wasn't dumb enough to say that out loud. More importantly, why did the Rimble go off like that? Harry said. Does it mean I've been obliviated? That puzzles me as well, Professor McGonagall said slowly. If it were that simple, I would think that the courts would use Grimballs, but they do not. I shall look into it, Mr. Potter, she sighed. You can go now. Harry started to get up from his chair, then halted. Sorry, I did have something else I wanted to tell you. You could hardly see the flinch. What is it, Mr. Potter? It's about Professor Quirrell. I'm sure, Mr. Potter, that it's nothing of importance. Professor McGonagall spoke the words in a great rush. Surely you heard the headmaster tell the students that you were not to bother us with any unimportant complaints about the defense professor. Harry was rather confused. But this could be important. Yes, but this could be important. Yesterday I got this sudden sense of doom when... Mr. Potter, I have a sense of doom as well, and my sense of doom is suggesting that you must not finish that sentence. Harry's mouth gaped open. Professor McGonagall had succeeded. Harry Potter was speechless. Mr. Potter, said Professor McGonagall, if you have discovered anything that seems interesting about Professor Quirrell, please feel free not to share it with me or anyone else. Now I think you've taken up enough of my valuable time. This isn't like you, Harry burst out. I'm sorry, but it just seems unbelievably irresponsible. From what I've heard, there's some kind of jinx on the defense profession. I think, and if you already know something's going to go wrong, I think you'd all be on your toes. Go wrong, Mr. Potter? I certainly hope not. Professor McGonagall's face was expressionless. After Professor Bleak was caught in a closet with no fewer than 3 fifth-year Slytherins last February, and a year before that, Professor Summers failed so completely as an educator that her students thought a boggart was a kind of furniture. It would be catastrophic if some problem with the extraordinarily competent Professor Quirrell came to my attention now, and I dare say most of our students would fail their defense hours and newts. I see, Harry said slowly, taking it all in. So in other words, whatever's wrong with Professor Quirrell, you desperately don't want to know about it until the end of the school year. And since it's currently September, he could assassinate the Prime Minister on live television and get away with it, so far as you're concerned. Professor McGonagall gazed at him unblinkingly. I am certain that I could never be heard endorsing such a statement from Mr. Potter. At Hogwarts, we strive to be proactive with respect to anything that threatens educational attainment of our students. Such as first-year Ravenclaws who can't keep their mouths shut. I believe I understand completely, Professor McGonagall. Oh, I doubt that, Mr. Potter. I doubt that very much. Professor McGonagall leaned forward, her face tightening again. Since you and I have already discussed matters far more sensitive than this, I shall speak frankly. You and you alone have reported this mysterious sense of doom. You and you alone are a chaos magnet, the likes of which I have never seen. After our little shopping trip to Diagon Alley, and then the Sorting Hat, and then today's little episode, I can well foresee that I am fated to sit in the headmaster's office and hear some hilarious tale about Professor Quirrell, in which you and you alone play a starring role, after which there will be no choice but to fire him. I am already resigned to it, Mr. Potter, And if the sad event takes place any earlier than the Ides of May, I will string you up by the gates of Hogwarts with your own intestines and pour fire beetles into your nose. Now do you understand me completely? Harry nodded, his eyes very wide. Then, after a second, what do I get if I can make it happen on the last day of the school year? Get out of my office! Thursday. There must have been something about Thursdays in Hogwarts. It was 5:32 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, and Harry was standing next to Professor Flitwick in front of the great stone gargoyle guarding the entrance to the headmaster's office. No sooner had he made it back from Professor McGonagall's office to the Ravenclaw study rooms than one of the students told him to report to Professor Flitwick's office, and there Harry had learned that Dumbledore wanted to speak with him. Harry, feeling rather apprehensive, had asked Professor Flitwick if the headmaster had said what this was about. Professor Flitwick shrugged in a helpless sort of way. Apparently Dumbledore had said that Harry was far too young to invoke the words of power and madness. Happy, happy, boom, boom, swamp, 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 Harry had thought, but not said aloud. Please don't worry too much, Mr. Potter, squeaked Professor Flitwick from somewhere around Harry's shoulder level. Harry was grateful for Professor Flitwick's gigantic puffy beard. It was hard getting used to a professor who was not only shorter than him, but spoke in a high-pitched voice. It Master Dumbledore may seem a little odd, or a lot odd, or even extremely odd, but he has never hurt a student in the slightest, and I don't believe he ever will. Professor Flitwick gave Harry an encouraging smile. Just keep that in mind at all times, and you'll be sure not to panic. This was not helping. Good luck, squeaked Professor Flitwick, and leaned over the gargoyle and said something that Harry somehow failed to hear. Of course the password wouldn't be much good if you could hear someone saying it, and the stone gargoyle walked aside with a very natural and ordinary movement that Harry found rather shocking, since the gargoyle still looked solid, immovable stone the whole time. Behind the gargoyle was a set of slowly revolving spiral stairs. There was something disturbingly hypnotic about it, and even more disturbing was that revolving, the spiral ought not to take you anywhere. Up you go, squeaked Flitwick. Harry rather nervously stepped out onto the spiral and found himself, for some reason that his brain couldn't seem to visualize at all, moving upwards. The gargoyle thudded back into place behind him, and the spiral stairs kept turning, and Harry kept being higher up. And after a rather dizzying time, Harry found himself in front of an oak door with a brass griffin knocker. Harry reached out and turned the doorknob. The door swung open, and Harry saw the most interesting room he'd ever seen in his life. There were tiny metal mechanisms that whirred or ticked or slowly changed shape or emitted light puffs of smoke. There were dozens of mysterious fluids in dozens of oddly shaped containers, all bubbling, boiling, oozing, changing colour or forming into interesting shapes that vanished half a second after you saw them. There were things that looked like clocks with many hands inscribed with numbers or in unrecognisable languages. There was a bracelet bearing a lenticular crystal that sparkled with 1,000 colours, and a bird perched atop a golden platform, and a wooden cup filled with what looked like blood, and a statue of a falcon encrusted in black emerald. The wall was all hung with pictures of people sleeping, and the sorting hat was casually poised on a hat rack that was also holding 2 umbrellas and 3 red slippers for left feet. In the midst of all the chaos was a clean black oaken desk. Before the desk was an oaken stool, and behind the desk was a well-cushioned throne containing Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, who was adorned with a long silver beard, a hat like a squashed giant mushroom, and what looked to Muggle eyes like 3 layers of bright pink pyjamas. Dumbledore was smiling, and his bright eyes twinkled with a mad intensity. With some trepidation, Harry set himself in front of the desk. The door swung shut behind him with a loud thunk. "Hello, Harry," said Dumbledore. "Hello, headmaster," Harry replied. So they were on a first-name basis. Would Dumbledore now say to call him? "Please, Harry," said Dumbledore. "Headmaster sounds so formal. Call me Heh for short." "I'll be sure to, Heh," said Harry. There was a slight pause. "Do you know," said Dumbledore, "you're the first person who's ever taken me up on that." "Ah," Harry said. He tried to control his voice despite the sudden sinking feeling in his stomach. "I'm sorry, Headmaster, you told me to do it, so I did." "Heh, please," said Dumbledore cheerfully. "And there's no call to be so worried. I won't launch you out the window just because you make one mistake. I'll give you plenty of warnings first. If you're doing something wrong, besides, what matters isn't how people talk to you, it's what they think of you." "He's never hurt a student. Just keep remembering that, and you'll be sure not to panic." Dumbledore drew forth a small metal case and flipped it open, showing some small yellow lumps. "Sherbet lemon," said the headmaster. "No, thank you, said Harry. "Does slipping LSD count as hurting them? Does slipping a student LSD count as hurting them? Or does that fall into the category of harmless fun?" "You, said something about my being too young to invoke the words of power and madness." "That you most certainly are," Dumbledore said. "Thankfully, the words of power and madness were lost 7 centuries ago, and no one has the slightest idea what they are anymore. It was just a little remark." "Ah," Harry said. He was aware that his mouth was hanging open. "Why did you call me here, then?" "Why?" Dumbledore repeated. "Ah, Harry, if I went around all day asking why I do things, I'd never have time to get a single thing done. I'm quite a busy person, you know." Harry nodded, smiling. "Yes, it's a very impressive list. Headmaster of Hogwarts, Chief Warlock of the Wizz and Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. Sorry to ask, but I was wondering, is it possible to get more than 6 hours if you use more than one time burner? Because it's pretty impressive you're doing all of that on just 30 hours a day." There was another slight pause, during which Harry went on smiling. He was a little apprehensive, actually a lot apprehensive, but once it had become clear that Dumbledore was deliberately messing with him, something within him absolutely refused to sit and take it like a defenceless lump. "I'm afraid time doesn't like being stretched out too much," said Dumbledore after a slight pause. "And yet we ourselves seem to be a little too large for it, and so it's a constant struggle to fit our lives into time." "Indeed," Harry said with grave solemnity. "That's why it's best to come to our points quickly." For a moment, Harry wondered if he'd gone too far. Then Dumbledore chuckled. "Straight to the point it shall be." The headmaster leaned forwards, tilting his squashed mushroom hat and brushing his beard against his desk. "Harry, this Monday you did something that should have been impossible even with a time turner, or rather impossible with only a time turner. Where did those pies come from, I wonder?" A jolt of adrenaline shot through Harry. He'd done that using the cloak of invisibility, the one that had been given him in a Christmas box along with a note, and that note had said, if Dumbledore saw a chance to possess one of the Deathly Hallows, he would never let it escape his grasp. "A natural thought," Dumbledore went on, "is that since none of the first years present were able to cast such a spell, someone else was present and yet unseen. And if no one could see them, why, it would be easy enough for them to throw the pies. One might further suspect that since you had a time turner, you were the invisible one, and that since the spell of disillusionment is far beyond your current capabilities, you had an invisibility cloak." Dumbledore smiled conspiratorially. "Am I on the right track so far, Harry?" Harry was frozen. He had the feeling that an outright lie would not be at all wise, and possibly not the least bit helpful, and he couldn't think of anything else to say. Dumbledore waved a friendly hand. "Don't worry, Harry, you haven't done anything wrong. Invisibility cloaks aren't against the rules. I suppose they're rare enough that no one ever got round to putting them on the list. But really, I was wondering something else entirely. Oh, Harry said in the most normal he could manage. Dumbledore's eyes shone with enthusiasm. You see, Harry, after you've been through a few adventures, you tend to catch the hang of these things. You start to see the pattern, hear the rhythm of the world. You begin to harbour suspicions before the moment of revelation. You are the boy who lived, and somehow an invisibility cloak made its way into your hands only 4 days after you discovered our magical Britain. Such cloaks are not for sale in Diagon Alley, but there is one which might find its own way to a destined wearer, and so I cannot help but wonder if, by some strange chance, you have found not just an invisibility cloak, but the cloak of invisibility, one of the 3 deathly hallows, and reputed to hide the wearer from the gaze of death himself. Dumbledore's gaze was bright and eager. May I see it, Harry? Harry swallowed. There was a full flood of adrenaline in his system now, and it was entirely useless. This was the most powerful wizard in the world, and there was no way he could make it out the door, and there was nowhere in Hogwarts for him to hide if he did. He was about to lose the cloak that had been passed down through the Potters for who knew how long. Slowly Dumbledore leaned back into his high chair. The bright light had gone out of his eyes, and he looked puzzled and a little sorrowful. Harry, said Dumbledore, if you don't want to, you can just say no. I can, croaked Harry. Yes, Harry, said Dumbledore. His voice sounded sad now and worried. It seems that you are afraid of me, Harry. May I ask what I have done to earn your distrust? Harry swallowed. Is there some way you can swear a binding magical oath that you won't take my cloak? Dumbledore shook his head slowly. Unbreakable vows are not to be used so lightly. And besides, Harry, if you did not already know the spell, you would have only my word that the spell was binding. Yet surely you realize that I do not need your permission to see the cloak. I am powerful enough to draw it forth myself, moleskin pouch or no. Dumbledore's face was grave. But this I will not do. The cloak is yours, Harry. I will not seize it from you, not even to look at it for just a moment, unless you decide to show it to me. That is a promise and oath. Should I need to prohibit you from using it on the school grounds, I will require you to go to your vault at Gringotts, and store it there. Ah, Harry said. He swallowed hard, trying to calm the flood of adrenaline and think reasonably. He took the moleskin pouch off his belt. If you really don't need my permission, then you have it. Harry held out the pouch to Dumbledore and bit down hard on his lip, sending that signal to himself in case he was obliviated afterwards. The old wizard reached into the pouch and, without saying any word of retrieval, drew forth the cloak of invisibility. Ah, breathed Dumbledore. I was right. He poured the shimmering black velvet mesh through his hand. Centuries old and still as perfect as the day it was made. We have lost much of our art over the years, and now I cannot make such a thing myself. No one can. I can feel the power of it like an echo in my mind, like a song forever being sung without anyone to hear it. The wizard looked up from the cloak. Do not sell it, he said. Do not give it to anyone as a possession. Think twice before you show it to anyone, and ponder 3 times again before you reveal it as a deathly hallow. Treat it with respect, for this is indeed a thing of power. And for a moment, Dumbledore's face grew wistful, and then he handed the cloak back to Harry. Harry put it back in his pouch. Dumbledore's face was grave once more. May I ask again, Harry, how you came to distrust me so? Suddenly, Harry felt rather ashamed. There was a note with the cloak, Harry said in a small voice. It said that you would try to take the cloak from me if you knew. I don't know who left the note, though, so I really don't. I see, said Dumbledore slowly. Well, Harry, I won't impugn the motives of whoever left you that note. Who knows but that they themselves may have had the best of good intentions. They did give you the cloak after all. Harry nodded, impressed by Dumbledore's charity and abashed at the sharp contrast with his own attitude. The old wizard went on. But you and I are both game pieces of the same colour, I think. The boy who finally defeated Voldemort, and the old man who held him off long enough to save the day. I will not hold your caution against you, Harry. We must all do our best to be wise. I will only ask that you think twice and ponder 3 times again. The next time someone tells you to distrust me. I'm sorry, Harry said. He felt wretched at this point. He'd just told all off Gandalf, essentially, and Dumbledore's kindness was only making him feel worse. I shouldn't have distrusted you. Alas, Harry, in this world, the wizard shook his head. I cannot even say that you were unwise. You did not know me, and in truth, there are some at Hogwarts whom you would do well not to trust. Perhaps even some you would call friends. Harry swallowed. That sounded rather ominous. Like who? Dumbledore stood up from his chair and began examining one of his instruments, a dial with 8 hands of varying length. After a few moments, the old wizard spoke again. He probably seems to you quite charming, said Dumbledore. Polite, to you at least. Well-spoken, maybe even admiring. Always ready with a helping hand, a favour, a word of advice. Oh, Draco Malfoy, Harry said, feeling rather relieved that it wasn't Hermione or something. Oh, no, you've got it all wrong. He's not turning me, I'm turning him. Dumbledore froze where he was peering at the dial. You're what? I'm going to turn Draco Malfoy from the dark side, Harry said. You know, make him a good guy. Dumbledore straightened and turned to Harry. He was wearing one of the most astonished expressions Harry had ever seen on anyone, let alone someone with a long silver beard. Are you certain, said the old wizard after a moment, that he is ready to be redeemed? I fear that whatever goodness you think you see within him is only wishful thinking, or worse, a lure, a bait. Not likely, Harry said. I mean, if he's trying to disguise himself as a good guy, he's incredibly bad at it. This isn't a question of Draco coming up to me and being all charming, and me deciding that he must have a hidden core of goodness deep down. I selected him for redemption specifically because he's the heir of House Malfoy, and if you had to pick one person to redeem, it would obviously be him. Dumbledore's left eye twitched. You intend to sow seeds of love and kindness in Draco Malfoy's heart because you expect Malfoy's heir to prove valuable to you? Not just to me, Harry said indignantly. To all of magical Britain. If this works out, and he'll have a happier and mentally healthier life with himself. Look, I don't have enough time to turn everyone away from the dark side, and I've got to ask where the light can gain the most advantage, the fastest. Dumbledore started laughing a lot harder than Harry would expect, almost howling. It seemed possibly undignified. An ancient, powerful wizard ought to chuckle in a deep, booming tones, not laugh so hard he was gasping for breath. Harry had once literally fallen out of his chair while watching the Marx Brothers movie Duck Soup, and that was how hard Dumbledore was laughing now. It's not that funny, Harry said after a while. He was starting to worry about Dumbledore's sanity again. Dumbledore got himself under control again with a visible effort. Harry, one symptom of the disease called wisdom is that you begin laughing at things that no one else thinks is funny, because when you are wise, Harry, you start getting the jokes. The old wizard wiped tears away from his eyes. Me. Oft evil will shall evil mar, indeed, in very deed. Harry's brain took a moment to place the familiar words. Hey, that's a Tolkien quote. Gandalf says that. Theoden, actually, says Dumbledore. You're Muggle-born, Harry said in shock. I'm afraid not, said Dumbledore, smiling again. I was born 70 years before that book was published, dear child, but it seems that my mugger-born students tend to think alike in certain ways. I've accumulated no fewer than 20 copies of Lord of the Rings and 3 sets of Tolkien's entire collected works. I treasure every one of them. Dumbledore drew his wand and held it up and struck a pose. You shall not pass. How does it look? Ah, Harry said in something approaching complete brain shutdown. I think you're missing a Balrog. And the bright pink pajamas and squashed mushroom hat were not helping in the slightest. I see, Dumbledore sighed and blandly sheathed the wand in his belt. I fear there have been very precious few Balrogs in my life of late. Nowadays it's all meetings of Wizengamot, where I must try desperately to prevent any work from getting done, and formal dinners where foreign politicians compete to see who can be the most obstinate fool, and being mysterious at people, knowing things I have no way of knowing, making cryptic statements which can only be understood in hindsight, and all the other small ways in which powerful wizards amuse themselves after they have left the part of the pattern that allows them to be heroes. Speaking of which, Harry, I have a certain something to give you, something which belonged to your father. You do? Said Harry. Gosh, who would have figured? Yes, indeed, said Dumbledore. I suppose it's a little predictable, isn't it? His face turned solemn. Nonetheless, Dumbledore went back into his desk, sat down, pulled out one of the drawers as he did so. He reached in using both arms and, straining slightly, pulled a rather large and heavy-looking object out of the drawer, which he then deposited on his oaken desk with a huge thunk. This, Dumbledore said, was your father's rock. Harry stared at it. It was light, grey, discoloured, irregularly shaped, sharp-edged, and very much a plain old ordinary large rock. Dumbledore had deposited it so that it rested on the widest available cross-section, but it still wobbled unstably on his desk. Harry looked up. This is a joke, right? It is not, said Dumbledore, shaking his head and looking very serious. I took this from the ruins of James and Lily's home in Godric's Hollow, where also I found you. I have kept it from then until now, against the day when I could give it to you. In a mixture of hypotheses that served as Harry's model of the world, Dumbledore's insanity was rapidly rising in probability, but there was still a substantial amount of probability allocated to other alternatives. Is it a magical rock? Not so far as I know, said Dumbledore, but I advise you with the greatest possible stringency to keep it close to about your person at all times. All right, Dumbledore was probably insane, but if he wasn't, well, it would be just too embarrassing to get in trouble from ignoring the advice of the inscrutable old wizard. That had to be like number 4 on the list of the top 100 obvious failure modes. Harry stepped forward and put his hands on the rock, trying to find some angle from which to lift without cutting himself. I'll put it in my pouch then. Dumbledore frowned. That may not be close enough to your person. And what if your moleskin pouch is lost or stolen? You think I should just carry a big rock everywhere I go? Dumbledore gave Harry a serious look. That might prove wise. Harry said. It looked rather heavy. I think the other students will tend to ask me questions about that. Tell them I ordered you to do it, Dumbledore said. No one will question that, since they all think I'm insane. His face was perfectly serious. To be honest, if you go around ordering students to carry rocks, I can kind of see why people would think that. Ah, Harry, said Dumbledore. The old wizard gestured a sweep with one hand around the room, and that seemed to take in all the mysterious instruments. When we are young, we believe that we know everything. And so we believe that if we see no explanation for something, that no explanation exists. When we are older, we realize that the whole universe works by a rhythm and a reason, even if we ourselves do not know it. It is only our own ignorance which appears to us as insanity. And it is 9 o'clock, and there's quite a bit left in this chapter. At least another 14 pages. So I think we're going to leave it there rather than go on for another half hour. And we'll just have to find out a bit more of what happens between Harry and Dumbledore in the next session. But at least Harry has his father's book. That's what's really important after all. See you next week.